I think one that I've seen kind of again and again, and in my own experience where I changed this and it really kind of leveled up the conversations that I had and just opened up a lot of doors from a sales perspective, was to not be scared of the big questions or the scary questions. Don't beat around the bush. Just, don't hide the price. Don't be scared to ask somebody if, what they actually want, how committed they are. Just have the conversation. Ask the question. It might feel a little awkward sometimes, but the more you kind of make it awkward, the more it's going to feel awkward. And, the more time you're potentially going to waste if somebody is just not ready to tell you no.
Really excited for this episode with Jeff Chamberlain. He's got some really good tidbits in here that he's going to share with us. I'm also pretty excited about what we've been talking about, particularly with I've known Jeff for a while as an individual contributor and a manager, and he's been great at both, and I've learned from him in the past, so I'm excited for you all to learn from him. What are you looking forward to, Harrison?
Yeah, same thing. I think he talks about some really good stuff around the transition from individual contributor to manager, back to individual contributor, and then back to manager again. And then I think he's got a really good tip at the end of the podcast for everybody out there around don't be afraid to ask the hard questions. It's going to be really important to do that in your sales career, no matter what. It's going to help you win more deals and help you come across as like an expert. So stick around for that. Lots of good stuff in here with Jeff. Hey, Jeff, welcome to the pod. Pumped to have you.
Hey, Harrison, thanks for having me. Hey, Nick.
Hey, mate. Good to see you.
As well.
So we did prime you. We gave you a heads up. So we asked the same question to everyone. Give us a funny or crazy story that's happening in your career.
Yeah. So this is a fairly easy one, I suppose. A sales call that I went on, this was probably like 8 years ago or so, a couple jobs ago. First time meeting this guy, had a really good kind of qualifying conversations and in-person meeting. It was in a San Francisco biotech company. I showed up to their location. They're kind of in the Oyster Point area. And just outside the building from the very beginning, I had a bit of a weird feel. There are like people kind of all over the place, talking to each other, very excited, like a lot of activity. Normally you go to a biotech company, it's pretty buttoned up and, people are just going about their days. So I got up to the 5th floor or something, wherever their offices were, and I was supposed to meet. And get out of the elevator, and there's more people just milling about and excitedly talking. No idea what's going on. Walk into their reception area, and it's honestly just like a total mess. There's nobody at the reception desk. There are people walking past me. Nobody's asking me if I've been helped. And so I'm just sitting there waiting, patiently watching all of this happen around me, doing my kind of reaching out to the contact to see if he's there and if he can come get me. And done my research on the company and, knew their leadership. It was small enough. And through the lobby comes the CEO, and he's talking animatedly and just like totally boisterous. I mean, this is like 11 a.m. too. So it's not late in the afternoon or anything. It is on a Friday, but I questioned, is the CEO like drinking right now? Because of everything that's going on and the way he was acting. He was actually super nice. He came up, said hello. Have you been helped? He's the first person to ask me that. And I said, no, I'm actually waiting for this guy. And, we're supposed to meet today. He's like, oh, let me go find him. He disappeared, and I'm waiting there again. Still have chaos, kind of people milling about, walking through the lobby. And finally, this guy comes out who I was supposed to meet with. And he's like, I'm really sorry, but we can't have our normal meeting today. We were actually just acquired. And so I showed up like literally as the announcement was coming out, and won't disclose the company or anything, but it's a very big acquisition. So like everybody should be celebrating, happy. And he's like, so I'm sorry, this obviously changes, any potential work we might have done together. Probably don't need to have the regular meeting, but if you want to come back to our celebration, and hang out for a while, then you're welcome to. And again, this was Friday, getting into the afternoon, and I was like, yeah, sure, let's go. So I went back, they had, beers on tap, everybody's partying in their break room. And so spent the afternoon with them celebrating their acquisition as, a total outsider, but certainly one of the more exciting sales calls I've ever been on.
That's awesome. It's like you get to show up and the party's just for you, Jeff. Yeah.
I was welcomed with open arms.
That's it. But everyone's going to remember the sales guy that turned up to the acquisition meeting. So you ever need to talk to them again, they're going to answer you. That was a good networking opportunity as well.
It was. I didn't get that sale, but the guy who I was supposed to meet with, we've stayed in touch. He's been at multiple other companies since then. He's made great introductions for me. We continue to meet and get coffee whenever we're in town together. So, it was still a very good relationship.
Yeah, great piece of career advice. When asked to come party with the company, do it.
Always say yes.
Yeah, and also that the CEO is definitely drinking, which is awesome, as you should be when you're celebrating that.
He had something to celebrate.
That you see some salespeople, you go to a conference, and there's this group of people that, like, you'll know they never go for the beer afterwards and stuff, and that's where the best connections happen. And I just never understood those guys that don't take that opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, to break down some of those barriers and have a real conversation and develop a real relationship, it means a lot.
Yeah. Yep.
Great.
Like, to your point, they remember you for years to come, and are now great recommendation for you to other people. So love it.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, let's dive into some of the topics we have today. So I think one of the main ones we really wanted to talk about was the difference between selling products and services. So you've done both of these things in the past, and I think for both people that are entering into sort of a sales role, that are thinking about, should I be selling products? Should I be selling services? What are the differences? What sort of things do I need to consider? What kind of advice or experience would you share with them?
Yeah, and it's funny because I actually totally flubbed this question in the very first interview I had for a sales job. Somebody on my interview committee, while everybody was around, after I gave my presentation, she asked me this question, what's the difference between selling products and services? And naively at the time, I said, I don't think there's that much of a difference. And to some extent, this is true. Some of the core fundamentals of how you approach a sale and how you work with customers is the same. You always need to do your research. You always need to, be able to talk about your capabilities and how they will address a client need. But, I was corrected in that interview and in my experience at that first sales job that I had, which was selling services, really learned kind of the intricacies of the differences between the two. I'd say, especially for someone just starting out, and I just saw a nice LinkedIn post about this that kind of summarized some of these differences and recommendations for, your first sales job. And the service tends to be more complex. Not just because, it's a actual process that needs to happen. And in science, processes are, highly variable. You can't control biology in all cases. But also just because it's, you can't just read off a list of features, right? And, to get ramped up for selling a product, it can be a complex product, but you can just really do your homework and understand how that product works and what its benefits are, what problems it addresses. Whereas the service involves the process of doing science, and so it's really important to understand that process in as much depth as possible. So I think from my background, coming from more technical training, that was a big advantage for me because I could understand kind of from beginning to end what they were doing in the lab that comprised the service that we were selling. And so that's not something that you need a PhD for necessarily, but having been in a lab and worked in a lab, I could relate to those different steps more directly and then present those to customers or answer questions when they had them. I think the biggest thing, though, the biggest difference is the importance of in building internal relationships and then being able to facilitate the conversations between the operations side of the company, so that the people who are actually doing the work to provide that service, and to, again, be that interface from that process to the customer and being able to share and kind of facilitate any conversations, any questions that they might have, status updates. Why is this not on track? It's an incredibly important dynamic to be able to kind of be the intermediary between that.
Yeah, so I think that's important that you're saying about the process of it, because often I've had a similar conversation with people and they're like, well, but is it just the price? Because services are normally more expensive. But if you take a 50K service and a 50K product, you still have that difference of complexity in the process, right? Because a product is, here's its features and it's not changing.
Yep. And with a product, you'll often have, a field application science team or something like that who can go out there and be like the technical on the ground. Whereas a service, they can come and visit your lab all they want. But ultimately, they're going to have to be hands off by design when it's a service.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And one thing that you did mention, which is sort of being the conduit between the customer and the internal team, we've seen it happen before where reps get really bogged down in sort of like the customer support side of stuff when it comes to services, so like status updates, doing essentially these repetitive, I would almost say like non-sales related activities, right? So it's not something that's going to help drive a new opportunity. It's more of how do you kind of maintain a relationship in a way, because not every team or not every company has internal resources to manage these communications. So how do you balance that, when you're selling complex services and you have, you need to keep that relationship positive, but at the same time, you've got a quota you got to go hit. And so how do you maintain that sort of balance?
Yeah. It could be really tricky and depends, I think, very much on how the company is set up to be able to respond to those types of requests. At my current company, which is smaller and has a lot of focus on kind of being responsive and really supporting the customer and partnering with the customer, which I think is just critical for any type of service organization. That's a pretty smooth process because I can either walk down the hall or, I know the scientist or scientists to be in touch with and I can get updates from them. As you start to grow and scale that gets really challenging. And I think important for company leadership in those situations to establish the communication channels and, the ways that projects are going to be communicated, the status of projects are going to be communicated to customers. So, just having that in place and knowing that challenge is going to come up of, your sales team can't handle all of that all the time because they need to focus a good amount of their time on actually selling. So I guess the long way of answering is, you need to calibrate based on what your internal systems are set up for. If you don't have any communication, then from a sales perspective, in my mind, you have to step into that role because this is not only your current customer, but most likely your future customer as well. If they're not happy with this project, then they're not going to come back to you. And that's, repeat business is the easiest business to get and the most important from a services standpoint. If you're selling a product that is an instrument, say they have their instrument, they'll run with it. Maybe they'll buy more instruments in the future, but a service is set up that, okay, we're done with this contract. What's the next one? Right. And so those relationships are really important to maintain. And so if you don't have the systems in place to provide those communication updates, then, my perspective is that, I have to step into that wherever needed.
Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. If you could do us a quick favor and share it with someone you know, it would mean the world to us. If you want to uplevel your sales skills or just network with other life science sales reps, check out the Succession community at succession.bio/join. Okay, now back to the show. Another, I think, interesting component between services and products is, maybe it's more around like how deep you have to go from like a discovery standpoint, because I think if you're selling certain types of services, right? I guess there's a spectrum of services. You have some services that are kind of like productized services. It's like, hey, we'll do this specific service for you, and this is the deliverable. Whereas you also have very customized services where it's more like maybe you're doing a big study or there's a lot of moving parts and you're putting together custom proposals. So I imagine in an instance like that, where you're doing these like really big customized services, the level of discovery and stakeholders that need to be involved is substantially higher than maybe like even like a productized service.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the complexity, again, will increase a lot based on, the kind of how defined the endpoint is from a service. And sometimes, that's kind of the important thing to establish up front in those discovery calls is what is our endpoint here?
What do you find by endpoint?
So kind of, what are the set of experiments what are the questions you're trying to answer, or what are we delivering, and really clearly defining that, because you can get into situations with services where it's, you're basically an extension of their research team. And you could just continue to do research for them under that same contract if you don't kind of define, okay, this is how much we'll do. This is how much troubleshooting we'll do. This is how much exploratory, investigation we'll do to get to that endpoint. But you really have to have kind of that endpoint and the steps along the way to get there pretty well defined in the contract from the beginning.
And I imagine there's lots of different people involved in that process too, right? Because you're probably, if it's a complex service, you're probably touching multiple steps, multiple points of like, the deliverable essentially. Like there's probably a lot of different workflows, a lot of different people that have to be involved to approve that. So how do you kind of navigate that like buying committee, if you will?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways it's similar to selling capital equipment because it tends to be a higher value exchange. It'll be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars rather than a few $100s for like reagents or a few $1,000s. And so that's kind of defined by the client and how they have their purchasing structured. And so for these higher value purchases, services, capital equipment, whatever the case, they're going to start to trigger, okay, well, now, director level and below can approve up to this much. But if you get over 50K, 100K, whatever the case, then you start to get procurement involved, or you need a VP level to sign off. And so again, from the beginning, kind of knowing and sharing what the scope will be, not only the technical scope, but kind of the financial outlay that would be required. What's the price of this service? You can start to get at, who is the customer buying team that needs to be involved and the decision makers that need to be engaged with from the beginning. And so, yeah, I think, services tend to have a bigger group, but that's mostly a function of the cost of the services rather than the complexity. In some ways, service is outsourced. And so they may not need as many technical stakeholders internally involved as like a large instrument purchase might.
Nice. Yeah, I appreciate that. So switching gears a little bit, if you don't mind, want to talk a bit about your transition. So at Synthego, you were an individual contributor. You came on as a rep, and then you were promoted after being very successful, I might say, and you were promoted into a regional sales manager. And then now you've kind of come back into a smaller company as a individual contributor again. And want to kind of talk through these nuances, some of the things that come up, things that people can think about and need to be aware of as maybe they might be going through similar situations.
Yeah, the first thing I would say is that I think I'm a much better individual contributor now that I have had the experience of being a manager, and I think I'm a better employee for my boss because I know the types of information that he wants, and I can filter the right things to him, ask for the right help from him, but largely be highly independent to kind of make my own decisions. And credit to him as well for kind of giving me the latitude to define how my day-to-day looks and the type of work that I do to reach the ultimate what our ultimate goal is bringing in more revenue from the company and helping our customers. So we're really aligned on the important things. But as an individual contributor now, I can kind of, set up my day as if, thinking of what would it be like to be managing me, and how do I, how can I be the most effective, both employee and individual contributor.
Interesting. Okay. And so then when you made the initial transition into management, what were some of those kind of wake up calls? You're like, oh, wow, this is way different than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, I think, I enjoyed being a manager far more than I thought I would. And Nick, I think you and I talked about this a month ago. It was kind of the fear, I think, initially of taking on that role was, as an individual contributor, you have all of your own challenges and problems that you have to deal with. And I sort of just saw becoming a manager as suddenly having to deal with everybody's problems, right? Like, I've got enough. I'm successful as an individual contributor. I have good accounts, good relationships. Like, I can manage this well. But moving into the manager role, yeah, you do get more people's problems that you have to help solve. But I found that I really enjoyed engaging with them and helping them solve those problems, helping them, troubleshoot their own sales process. And so I think that was kind of a very good, happy realization that I enjoyed it a lot more. I also had a great team and, enjoyed working with them. So that certainly helped. As far as something that that I think helped me be successful is that some of my natural instincts and my own process for being an individual contributor of, taking really good notes, being really prepared for meetings, that translated really well to being a manager as well. Now, most of the time, instead of preparing for meetings with potential clients, I was preparing for my one-on-ones or preparing for a team meeting and helping coach my team on how to do that themselves. So, I think, I was fortunate that kind of my own workflows translated well, but those are some of the important things that I did previously that really worked well as a manager too.
Something you said there was really important because you and I are very different in the way we approach things, and you're much more methodical than I am. I still hope that I was quite useful for my team as a manager and anyone else I've managed in the past. But I think what's important is that you lean into your strengths and don't try and be something you're not as a manager. Like, my team knew that I'm not as methodical as you, and they're your team. They're part of you. They actually pick up some of that slack, knowing what I could bring was something else. And we worked as a team. And I think sometimes as a manager, people forget that you're part of that team. You're not just sitting above it. You have a role in it. And I think that's really important. And you kind of said that, but I just wanted to make sure I highlighted it.
Yeah, I think you summarized that really well. And I think you're dead on that, lean into the things you're good at, know where you're maybe not as good. And either your team can kind of step into that themselves, or you can bring in some help to be able to do that as well. Really good point.
Yeah, I think that was something that we had really well put together at Cithago, was sort of the ecosystem of people that you could bring in to help and do different things. I think everybody really supported each other really well. So I think when you get to a certain size of company, you have that ability where you can, turn to your right and turn to your left and say, hey, I need your help on this. And, people will be there for you.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, a lot harder to do at a small company. A lot of the times you're just sitting there by yourself and you're just like, oh, I got nobody here. Who do I turn to? So yeah, that can be tough.
Jeff, as an individual contributor at a senior level, you're looking over your shoulder like, I'll get so-and-so. Oh, no, I've got to do that. All right. There's no one there to pick it up.
It all rolls up. Yeah. And yeah, I think, that's something that excites me too, though, is, the idea of building something and, establishing good systems, processes, frameworks to then, as the company grows, build a team underneath me. And so that's something, again, back to your question about being an individual contributor now, I'm thinking of it not just how do I do the best that I can right now, but also how do I establish systems and frameworks that will allow this company to grow successfully.
You're talking dirty to me. I love that stuff. Systems, process, frameworks get me excited. I love it. Spend all day talking about that.
Go and leave.
I think one thing that would be helpful for people that maybe are in management roles today, but they are maybe thinking about making another move to another company, how should they be thinking about either a horizontal move or what might be perceived as like a step backwards? Because I think there's a stigma around, hey, I was a manager, an individual contributor. It's like, is this going to look bad on my resume? Like, How can we eliminate that stigma for people?
Yeah, I think, there's a few different situations where that can happen, and in neither case should it be looked at as a step back. In kind of general, and I've interviewed people in this situation previously when we were filling out our team at Synthago, people had gone from individual contributor to manager and back. And one person who I spoke with, interviewed, who I think answered it really well, is, just said, look, like I enjoyed being an individual contributor much more. I think I did fine as a manager, and but my kind of day to day and what I was doing, I enjoyed a lot more when I was an individual contributor. So she just owned it, and I loved that. I don't think, I didn't have any preconceived notion about it being a step back necessarily for her, but if I did, I think she would have put those fully to rest, because she came in confidently and said, I tried both. I found that I was really good at being an individual contributor, so I wanted to go back to that. I think there's, in my situation at least, I'm excited to eventually be a manager again. And my transition is more, in the way I'm looking at it, is more going to a smaller company that is trying to grow. And so, like I mentioned, building out the frameworks and kind of a book of business that is sufficient to support growth. And so if I've done my job well, then I'll be able to build a team.
I also I think that there's no step backwards, right? If you've got skills that you've learned and you're continuing to grow, I think that's the thing. We see it as a linear progression from contributor to manager to VP. But you can be a VP of a 2-person company or a manager of a 30-person team. They're different roles and skills, and if you've got those skills, you should go do it and contribute to the company. And if you're doing that, I think you're doing the right thing, as long as you're enjoying it and the company's getting value out of it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, to your point, you mentioned earlier, you are now a better individual contributor because of your experience as a manager, right? And I imagine too, when you build the team up to get to that point where you're now managing them again, you've got that book of business where it is to support growth. I imagine you're going to be a better manager having now been an individual contributor again after being a manager. So you have you're basically stacking all of these experiences on top of each other, like building up all of these different skills, and they're going to combine to help you be, the best in whatever future role you've got.
Yeah, for sure. And always kind of learning from every step along the way and building off of that foundation that you've built historically.
Yep. Love it. One other thing we wanted to talk about. So you also do a lot of mentorship work, right? You do a little work with the Fred Hutch, and would love to learn a little bit more about that. And kind of how do you think about mentoring a future generation of people who potentially might want to get into sales?
Yeah, it's something that I enjoy a lot, and it's partly because I remember where I was at that point. As a PhD grad student, eagerly trying to get into industry. I knew I didn't want to continue to do science at that point. I decided that in grad school. I loved science. I loved kind of the healthcare industry and having a contribution towards improving human health, but that transition, but knew that I didn't want to do science. Right? I didn't want to do bench work anymore. That was not my best set of skills. And so I wanted to kind of figure out how do I help translate discoveries that are made in the lab into industry so it can have an impact on patients. There are a lot of people who kind of have that vision. Very small percentage of PhD students or postdocs are going to actually go into industry, or let alone into academia, right? They're going to translate those skills somewhere into industry. And it's a really difficult path to walk, and, not something you have a lot of visibility for as a grad student or a postdoc. So that's kind of my motivation for being involved with it's like the Fred Hutch, it's a mentor network. So I'm kind of part of a list that people can find me on that list and reach out. But there's a lot with like UW, University of Washington, where I went as well. And so, I'm just kind of open to having those conversations anytime. And I think, they hopefully by advice and sharing my experience is helpful for them. I think maybe a piece of advice for anybody who's reaching out and kind of having some of those, establishing a mentor or just having those mentorship conversations, is to continue to follow up with the people who have been acting as a mentor, whether it's one meeting or multiple meetings. Very few follow up after that first meeting.
Almost never. See it all the time. Like literally we'll have a great conversation and it's like, okay, then you just don't hear from them again. It's like, well, what happened? I want to know, like keep me informed. Like,
yeah,
doesn't mean we always have to have like a follow-up meeting, but let's stay informed and keep that person informed of, was their feedback helpful? Were you successful in what you were trying to accomplish? So yeah.
In continuing to leverage them in any way that you can. And I'll be honest, I'm guilty of this as well. For when I was in the mentee situation, and not keeping that line of connection. But now that's something I've added into kind of my list of advice is, don't be afraid to bother me or other people, right? Continue to leverage the network and build a relationship over time. So yeah, I think, I do think it's been effective with a handful of those people who have followed up and kind of updated me on, their progress and whether or not they found a job in industry or whatever that they were looking for. And those are, just the low commitment, but really high value relationships that, now we can tap into each other as we progress in our careers, at any point, because we have kind of that initial kind of introduction and we know each other, we know where we've been, what we're interested in. So yeah, they're just great relationships that are of value to me as well.
So, well, we're coming up here on time. So we got one last question for you. Everybody listens here. They love their tactics. They love their techniques. So what's one like really actionable takeaway that you can give somebody that's, in sales today?
A lot of kind of different bits and pieces, but I think one that I've seen kind of again and again, and in my own experience where I changed this and it really kind of leveled up my, the conversations that I had and just opened up a lot of doors from a sales perspective, was to not be scared of the big questions or the scary questions. Don't beat around the bush. Just, don't hide the price. Don't be scared to ask somebody if, what they actually want, how committed they are. Just have the conversation, ask the question. It might feel a little awkward sometimes, but the more you kind of make it awkward, the more it's going to feel awkward. And, the more time you're potentially going to waste if somebody is just not ready to tell you no. Right.
And I think if you're like genuinely curious, like throughout the conversation that you're having, and you're really coming from a viewpoint of, I'm trying to help you as a customer or a potential customer of ours, and like, I want to make sure you hit your outcome, your question is going to come across as genuine, and it's not going to come across as, this like big, crazy sales question or whatever, right? Where you're going to come across as pushy. Yep. It's, it comes from a genuine place. You're in a good spot.
Yeah, don't say nothing for the whole meeting and then scream, "Where's my PO?" That's not going to go well, right?
But, it might. Yeah, it might. Has anybody tried that? Somebody should try that.
Yeah.
We should A/B test it on the next call. Awesome. Well, Jeff, it's been a pleasure. Great to see you again, and appreciate all the insights that you brought to everybody here on the podcast.
No, thanks for having me on, guys, and thanks for building Succession. I'm loving what you guys are doing, and yeah, excited to be a part of it.